Iron Line history. Imagine a chemical attack that makes people burn alive from the inside, while doctors are strictly forbidden to know which poison is killing their patients. The most horrifying part of this story? Hitler did not carry out this attack. Allied soldiers and civilians were poisoned by the Allies themselves, Americans and British. It all happened because of one single secret, locked inside the hold of an ordinary cargo ship. That evening, in the Italian port of Bari, every floodlight was switched on, so the work could move faster. In reality, they were lighting up the perfect target for German bombers. In early December 1943, there was no room to move in the harbor of Bari, in southern Italy. Dozens of ships stood so tightly packed that their sides almost scraped against each other. Their holds were bursting with fuel, shells, and vehicles. On shore, the lights burned everywhere, and cranes unloaded ships without stopping. Command demanded speed. Forget camouflage. Forget safety. The only thing that mattered was faster. And in the middle of all that chaos stood an American Liberty ship, the SS John Harvey. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary gray workhorse of the war. But inside its holds was a cargo known to only a handful of people in all of Europe. 2,000 aircraft bombs filled with mustard agent. What is mustard agent? It is also known as mustard gas. It was one of the great nightmares of the First World War. In essence, it is an oily liquid that, as it evaporates, turns into an invisible poisonous vapor. When it touches the skin, it causes terrible chemical burns and huge blisters. If a person breathes it in, it burns the lungs, blinds him, and kills him in agony. Officially, the Americans did not bring this hellish arsenal to Italy for an attack. It was a secret insurance policy. If the Nazis dared to use chemical weapons first, the Allies had to be ready to answer in kind, immediately. But secrets in wartime have another side. The poison bombs were not sitting in armored vaults. They were in an ordinary cargo hold, right next to tons of gasoline. The sailors and dock workers on the pier had no idea they were unloading a deadly poison. And when the disaster begins, no one will shout, "There is gas, run." The men who knew the secret of the John Harvey will die first, and everyone else will be doomed. To understand how American chemical weapons ended up in a quiet Italian port at all, we need to rewind a little. By the end of 1943, the war in Europe had reached a critical point. The Allies, a coalition that included the United States, Great Britain, and another dozen countries, with Canadians, New Zealanders, and Poles also fighting in this sector, had carried out a powerful operation that summer. They landed on Sicily, captured it quickly, crossed to the south of mainland Italy, and brought down the Italian dictator Mussolini. Italy officially surrendered and left the war. So victory was close? Not even close. The German army had not gone anywhere. Hitler understood that if the Allies pushed all the way through Italy, they would come straight toward Germany's borders. So the Germans rapidly occupied the north and center of the country. They dug into the mountains, blew up bridges behind them, mined roads, and turned every kilometer of Italian ground into a bloody grinder. The Americans and British had to break north toward Rome. But in the mountains, tanks are useless without a colossal amount of supply. Every day, the infantry needed millions of rounds of ammunition, field rations, tons of gasoline, and new guns. The front was literally devouring resources, and the main pump feeding those resources became the port of Bari. It stood on the eastern coast at the upper part of the heel of Italy's boot. The logic was as simple as a rail. If the port of Bari unloaded ships on time, the front moved forward. If the port jammed, soldiers in the mountains were left without ammunition, and the aircraft of the American 15th Air Force were left without fuel. The offensive simply began to suffocate. Because of this frantic race for supply, Bari turned into a giant traffic jam. Ships arrived faster than they could be unloaded. There was catastrophically little space at the piers, and vessels lined up in a tight queue out in the outer anchorage. In effect, the harbor had become a huge, motionless target made of hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives and fuel. And into this powder keg, on November 28, 1943, came the American transport SS John Harvey. Its route had been long and careful: Baltimore, Norfolk, a transatlantic convoy to North Africa, Sicily, and finally southern Italy. In its holds, remember, were those same 2,000 mustard bombs. That deadly cargo had been born from pure fear. After the nightmares of the First World War, chemical weapons were considered an absolute taboo. But in 1943, Allied intelligence seriously feared that a cornered Hitler might go to extremes and unleash poison gas. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt openly stated that America would not use chemical weapons first, but if the Germans crossed that line, the response would be devastating. But to respond, a weapon of retaliation had to be close at hand. That was the central drama. Beautiful political declarations, in reality, became this: the most dangerous cargo imaginable was simply standing in the middle of an overcrowded civilian port. The captain of the John Harvey understood perfectly well what he was sitting on, and he unsuccessfully begged headquarters to unload his ship out of turn. He was refused. Why? A dangerous psychological factor had taken hold: the fatigue of the victors. American and British generals had decided that the German Luftwaffe had already been crushed. Intelligence reported that, on that entire front, the Germans had at most 30 serviceable aircraft left. Port air defense was openly neglected, no night fighter cover was on duty, and blackout discipline was simply canceled. Why waste time and fumble in the dark when you could switch on the floodlights and unload ships twice as fast? The enemy would not come anyway. As a result, the port of Bari shone in the night like an enormous Christmas tree. But the British generals were wrong. In northern Italy, the commander of the German air fleet, General Wolfram von Richthofen, had secretly gathered a powerful strike force, more than 100 Junkers Ju-88 bombers. On the evening of December 2nd, they took off. The German pilots hardly needed radar or navigators. The bright glow of Bari's floodlights could be seen from dozens of kilometers away. They flew toward the light like moths. In the port, work still boiled on. Dock workers cursed beside the cranes. And inside the hold of the John Harvey, 2,000 chemical bombs waited quietly for their hour. Only seconds remained before the disaster that would divide thousands of lives into before and after. The most frightening thing about a secret weapon is that you cannot speak about it out loud, at all, under any circumstances. The captain of the John Harvey and several cleared officers understood perfectly well what kind of powder keg was under their feet. But wartime secrecy completely overruled any logic of port safety. If the leadership of the port of Bari had known that one of the ships carried deadly mustard agent, that transport would have been unloaded first. It would have been moved to a separate pier, guarded, and listed in the paperwork as a special risk object. But a secret cargo behaves differently. In secret documents, it can be incredibly important. In closed meetings at high headquarters, it can be priority number one. But on an overcrowded pier, choking under the pressure of work, it instantly becomes an ordinary gray box. One more faceless ship that must quietly wait its turn. And the John Harvey waited. It was not unloaded on the day it arrived, November 28. It was ignored on the 29th. It was not remembered on the 30th. Its turn still had not come on December 1st. For 5 days, a deadly chemical arsenal simply sat by the mole, squeezed in on every side by other ships. Around it, life went on around the clock. Sailors smoked on decks, cranes moved crates of shells, tankers pumped tons of high-octane fuel. If this were a scene from a Hollywood film, the audience would already be biting their nails, understanding that this could not end well. But in real life, disaster almost never looks like disaster in advance. It looks ordinary, like an annoying delay, like an endless queue, like a normal working evening in a port that simply needs to be unloaded before dawn. Meanwhile, the evening of December 2nd arrived. The port of Bari was fully illuminated, and this is not just a pretty detail for the picture. It was a fatal decision. The lights were turned on for one purpose: to speed up the work, because the front in northern Italy desperately needed supplies. But for the German pilots crossing the Adriatic Sea at that very moment, it meant only one thing: the target had lit itself up. According to official military medical reports, the attack began at 7:20 p.m. Other sources give 7:30 p.m., but by then, the difference no longer mattered. The night had only just begun. From the east, from the Adriatic, German Junkers Ju-88 bombers came toward the port of Bari at high speed. More than 100 aircraft, and they were not flying a random chaotic raid. German command struck at the narrowest, most vulnerable point in the entire Allied logistics system. The Germans understood perfectly well. If the port of Bari stopped working, supply for the entire Italian campaign would slow down. The advance on Rome would begin to choke, and the American 15th Air Force would be left without aviation fuel at its airfields. Sometimes one properly destroyed port is worth far more than an entire captured city. And down below, the floodlit port was absolutely unprepared for the blow. German pilots dropped tons of foil reflectors, window, which blinded Allied radar. The Germans appeared out of the darkness with a surprise the relaxed port should never have given them. But it did. The anti-aircraft defense was critically weak. After that, everything happened instantly. It did not drag on for hours. It did not last all night. The Germans needed only 20 minutes. 20 minutes is almost nothing in history, but it is more than enough when below you dozens of ships stand side by side, packed to the top with explosives and fuel. The first bombs dealt mortal wounds to the port. Explosions kissed one ship, then another. One blast tore open the main shore oil pipeline. Thousands of tons of fuel under tremendous pressure poured straight into the harbor and ignited at once. Burning tankers began to explode, adding their own contents to the inferno. Within minutes, the water in the harbor stopped being water in any ordinary sense. It became a roaring black mirror of pure fire. Ships that had not even been hit directly were trapped in fiery pincers. Red-hot fragments of steel rained down on the piers. The blast wave was so powerful that windows shattered in houses miles from the center of the explosion. Everything around burned, collapsed, and howled. People, maddened by the heat, jumped straight into burning water. Some were thrown overboard by explosions. Others climbed out themselves because the deck beneath their feet had become a red-hot skillet. In that smoke, in the screams, in the fire and darkness, no one yet knew the main thing. The real danger was only being born. The transport John Harvey was not the main object rescue crews were watching in the first minutes. Huge ships were exploding in the port even without it. Too much fire, too much panic, too many orders being shouted at the same time. According to Health.mil, the John Harvey was not initially hit directly by a German bomb, but it was standing too close to the center of the disaster. Burning debris from neighboring exploding ships rained down onto its deck. A fire aboard the ship with the secret cargo became only a matter of time. And then the John Harvey exploded. It was a monstrous blast. Everyone on board died in the same microsecond. And that meant more than the loss of the crew. It meant that the only people who could have shouted the most important warning to the rescuers disappeared instantly in the flames. Do not treat this water like ordinary water. Do not leave survivors in these clothes. Do not think this is just oil. There is mustard agent there. There is deadly gas there. But there was no one left to say it. The captain and his officers were dead. When the John Harvey was torn apart, the thin metal casings of 2,000 chemical bombs burst open. Mustard agent escaped. Part of the liquid poison instantly evaporated in the wild heat, joined the smoke, and became a poisonous cloud that the wind pushed toward the sleeping city. The rest poured by the ton into the harbor water, where it mixed perfectly with the thick oil slick from the exploded tankers. And all of this happened in the same place where the rescue operation was already in full swing. One after another, hundreds of shocked, burned people were pulled from the water. They were all covered in a thick layer of black, sticky fuel oil. And it looked completely expected. After the oil pipeline explosion and the tanker fires, a man covered in oil did not seem like a mystery to the medics. He looked like an ordinary lucky survivor who had managed to live through an oil fire. That was exactly what made it so terrifying. Because the oil film became the perfect fixative for mustard agent, it prevented the poison from evaporating away, locking it onto skin and soaking it into the survivors' clothing. The men were not merely dirty. Every second, they continued to receive a colossal dose of chemical weapon. They were relieved to be alive. They wrapped themselves in warm blankets they had been given, and the clock was already ticking against them. No one around understood that the saving blankets were becoming shrouds. At the same time, the first wounded began arriving at Bari's hospitals. Doctors expected the familiar horrors of war: torn shrapnel wounds, thermal burns from flame, severe shock, hypothermia after long exposure to winter water. And all of that was there. But very soon, among the hundreds of patients, men began to appear who did not fit the normal picture of military medicine at all. At first, it did not stand out. When hundreds of mutilated people arrive in a chaotic mass, disaster medicine does not work like a perfect detective story. It works like a brutal, exhausting struggle against an endless human tide. In the hospitals of Bari, there was utter hell. The wounded arrived by the hundreds. Military triage in such moments works at the limit. Doctors have only seconds to decide whom to save first, whom to drag straight into surgery, whom to bandage, and whom it is already too late to save. Most of the sailors pulled from the water were covered from head to toe in a thick layer of fuel oil. Physically, many of them looked relatively stable. They had no missing limbs or deep shrapnel wounds. So the medics followed the standard protocol for hypothermia. The men were not undressed immediately. They were wrapped in warm blankets, given hot tea, and left to rest in corridors. This was not malice. It was not simple negligence. It was the tragic result of a wrong diagnosis. If a person is freezing after winter water and in shock, he must be warmed and allowed to rest. If he is covered in oil, that is unpleasant, but it can wait. But if that oil is tightly mixed with mustard agent, everything is reversed. The men should not have been wrapped in blankets. They should have been stripped immediately, their clothing cut away, their heads shaved, and their bodies washed for hours under strong streams of warm water and soap. Instead, the blankets acted like a lethal greenhouse. They trapped the poisonous vapors of mustard agent and helped it sink deeper into the soldiers' heated skin. The first strange complaints from the wounded sounded almost ordinary. "Doctor, it feels like my eyes are full of sand." Then came a terrible burning across the whole body. Hours passed, and men who only a short time earlier had seemed like lucky survivors suddenly began to collapse. They went blind. Their skin broke out in huge chemical blisters. Their lungs turned to pulp. Doctors saw horrifying symptoms, but they did not understand the cause, because the truth was classified. Panic rumors began to crawl through the hospital corridors. A ship with gas had exploded in the harbor. But in war, a rumor is not an order, and it is not an official diagnosis. Until the diagnosis is spoken out loud by command, the medical system keeps treating the wrong disaster. The most frightening paradox of mustard agent is that it does not kill instantly like poison in a movie. It is a treacherous, delayed-action poison. It gives a person false hope. Several hours of grace in which he can think, "I survived. The worst is behind me." A man breathes. He talks. He jokes with the nurses. And inside him, the clockwork of death is already ticking. Only 12 to 14 hours after the raid, when the characteristic torn casings of chemical bombs were finally found on the piers, did headquarters understand what had happened. An emergency-coded message went to the hospitals. It may be mustard agent, but precious time had been lost forever. And in chemical disasters, lost hours mean mountains of bodies. To make sense of the chaos, command sent Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Francis Alexander to Bari. He was not just a military doctor. He was one of America's leading experts on chemical weapons. Alexander arrived not in a sterile laboratory, but on a scorched ruin. The hospitals were paralyzed. The doctors were demoralized. They had already seen everything in this war, but they could not understand why their patients were rotting alive from within. Alexander began to work like a detective. He compared the facts: delayed symptoms, blinded eyes, burned airways, the oily film on the water. The puzzle came together instantly. It was pure, concentrated mustard agent. Thanks to Alexander, treatment was finally corrected. But medicine cannot undo the past. To this day, we do not know the exact number of victims. The figures in the sources vary slightly. According to the U.S. Naval Institute, 617 people were affected by mustard agent. Medical archives from Health.mil give the figure as 628 military personnel. Dozens of them died in agony in the first weeks. And that does not include hundreds of Italian civilians whose bodies were never properly counted. But the surreal horror of Bari is best illustrated by the story of one surviving Allied ship. That night, its crew performed an act of courage. They bravely pulled drowning men out of the burning water. After the raid, the ship safely weighed anchor and put out to sea. It had survived the infernal bombing. It did not have a single hole in its hull. But several hours later, out in the open sea, the crew began to go blind, one after another. Men lost their sight at their battle stations. The ship became a Flying Dutchman, full of blind men, and completely lost its fighting ability. All because they had passed through water that seemed like nothing more than dirty water after an ordinary fire. And here the central question appears, the question that turns the tragedy of Bari from an ordinary war drama into a horrifying political thriller. Why did headquarters stay silent? Why was the port not warned in advance? The answer is cynical. And in this story, there is no single villain sitting in an office. The system itself did the work. The Allies were terrified of admitting that they had brought chemical weapons into Europe. Officially, their position was purely defensive. But for world propaganda and diplomacy, it would have been a colossal, radioactive scandal. To admit that an American ship in an Italian port was packed to the top with banned mustard agent meant opening Pandora's box. They would have had to answer uncomfortable questions. Why was it brought there? Who gave the order? Why was it kept secret from their own people? Why did that secrecy cause doctors to learn the truth too late and lose lives? Military propaganda always loves simple, beautiful phrases. For example, The treacherous enemy bombed a peaceful port. That is easy to understand. It fits newspaper headlines. But the truth of Bari was too dirty to show the world. Allied command was terrified of a political scandal. To admit that in the middle of the war, they had dragged an entire ship full of banned chemical weapons into Italy meant opening Pandora's box. So the secrecy system was tightened to the maximum. Every report was immediately classified. In the medical records of surviving soldiers, any mention of the word mustard was scrubbed out. Officially, they were dying from ordinary burns received as a result of enemy action. The dangerous secret was guarded so carefully that it erased the memory of the tragedy itself, and for decades, the port of Bari remained in the shadow of Normandy and Berlin. But it is right here, on the ashes, that history takes its most unexpected and brutal turn. That same mustard agent that turned the lungs of hundreds of soldiers to pulp suddenly became the starting point for saving millions of lives in the future. It became one of the foundations of modern anti-cancer chemotherapy. While carrying out autopsies in Bari, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Alexander noticed one abnormal fact. Mustard gas did not merely burn skin and mucous membranes. It destroyed white blood cells, leukocytes, at the root, and completely emptied the victim's lymph nodes. After contact with the poison, the human blood-forming system literally shut down. Alexander recorded these findings in his secret report. When that document reached American pharmacologists at Yale University, Louis Goodman and Alfred Gilman, they immediately seized on the terrible mechanism. The scientists reasoned in a way that was brilliant and simple. If this substance so aggressively and completely kills rapidly dividing healthy blood cells, why not use a modified version of it to destroy other rapidly dividing cells? For example, malignant tumors in leukemia or lymphoma. Goodman and Gilman had already been conducting secret experiments on rabbits with so-called nitrogen mustard. But it was Alexander's detailed data from real human victims in Bari that became the missing link and the undeniable proof. Soon in a clinic in New York, a terminally ill patient with malignant lymphosarcoma, known in medical records by the initials JD, was given a synthesized analog of mustard gas for the first time in history, the drug mustine. The result stunned the doctors. The huge tumor on the patient's neck literally melted away within days. Yes, mustine was incredibly toxic, and the cancer returned after a time. But the barrier had been broken. For the first time, medicine understood that cancer could be burned from within by chemistry. Modern oncology was born from Bari. Of course, that scientific triumph does not make the wartime disaster bright, and it does not turn the dead into a necessary price of progress. Bari was not a sterile laboratory. It was a burning hell where blinded men screamed in pain, not understanding what was killing them. If there is one main lesson to draw from this story, it sounds much harsher. Secrecy without an emergency exit kills. The explosion at Bari is sometimes called the European Pearl Harbor for a reason. But if in Hawaii, the Americans were smashed only by the weapons of the enemy, then in Italy, their own secrecy did half of that terrible work for the Germans. The weapon they had kept for a dark day, as the ultimate argument of final horror, became that horror itself. And the most frightening words of this disaster did not come as an air raid siren. They did not come in the thunder of detonation. They were spoken in a whisper, in a hospital corridor, when it was already too late to save someone. There was gas.